Surviving for minutes or even hours is one thing, but I'm fascinated by people who've managed to go beyond that. People like Steve Callahan, who survived for 2.5 months after being shipwrecked. Steve had been sailing since the age of 12, intent on a life of adventure. In 1982, he stocked his boat here in the Canaries before enjoying a last beer and setting out across the Atlantic. Steve had sailed from America to England to compete in a race back across the Atlantic, but he'd been forced out of that by bad weather and had to make repairs in Spain. The Canaries were his last landfall before setting out to complete his journey. There you go, Jerry.
Welcome aboard.
Good to see you.
I had probably done about 40,000 miles or so of sailing. I'd been back and forth to Bermuda, I don't know, at least a half dozen times or so, and been across the Atlantic once and so on. So I was what I consider moderately experienced as a sailor.
Steve told his family and friends that his trip should take about a month, but that if conditions were against him, it could take much longer. Within a week, he was wishing he could have been more precise.
The initial moments were a lot of things happening at once, a tremendous explosion, and water came thundering in, like a river flowing into the boat. I'm pretty sure it was something that T-boned the boat. My presumption is it was a whale, but I'll never know for sure. The water was coming in very, very fast, and there was no question in my mind I had to get out of the boat. I knew that I really needed my ditch kit, so I took the chance of diving down and feeling around, getting that.
On board his raft, Steve had made some really good preparations. He had paddles with which he could obviously move it and ward off sharks. He had flares. He had a signal mirror, 6 pints of tinned water, some fishing kit, navigation equipment. That was going to prove vitally important. And he had a couple of these solar stills with which he could turn salt water into fresh drinking water. In his ditch kit, Steve had a few other useful emergency items. He kept a Tupperware box in which he had 21 more emergency flares. He had some emergency food, he had a knife, some pencils, 2 more pints of water, and most crucially of all, he had this, a spear gun. Although he was better prepared than many who found themselves in similar situations, Steve was initially pessimistic about his chances.
I was just about smack dab in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and there was certainly a big part of me that said, forget it, you're not even going to get out of here. I realized that in the area I was in, I would be pushed by the currents and the trade winds towards the West Indies. Unfortunately, I figured it would take me about 2.5, 3 months in order to reach that land, and I didn't really think that I could live that long. But this book proved to be crucial. It's a manual to sea survival that contains just about everything you need to know to live from the sea. It was compiled by Dougal Robertson, who spent 38 days adrift with his family in 1972. Fortunately, Steve had included one of these in his ditch kit. It provided me both with concrete information and also a reminder of his own tale. Knowing that people somehow were able to create a life for themselves, even in the middle of this sort of what I often call the watery desert of the world, the ocean, gave me a great inspiration. The basic theory is that you can live about 10 days without water and you can live a month without food. So water is the definite priority. I had about 8 pints of water in my ditch kit. So I figured, well, maybe I've got 18 days to live, which wasn't even enough time to get me to the shipping lanes, the nearest shipping lanes. I looked out on the ocean and it was beautiful. It was like a swimming pool 3 miles deep, just gorgeous water. But it's the old ancient mariner thing of water everywhere and not a drop to drink.
The reason you can't drink seawater is that if you do, the amount of salt in your body increases, which means you have to take water from your vital organs to dilute it. In other words, you dehydrate and die more quickly than if you drank no water at all.
Dehydration is just a horrible, horrible thing. It was important to ration the water, and I'm sitting there going, okay, in another half hour I get to take this other little teeny bit of water in my mouth, and it's such a joy when you do, and then you wait for another hour or 2 hours. So it just dominates your entire being.
But there are a couple of pieces of modern equipment that can help you turn seawater into fresh water. This is a solar still. What we've got here is a ring section that helps it float and a condenser section, both of which need inflating. Through this tube here, you fill the central portion with seawater. And under the action of the sun, that condenses as fresh water here, runs down on the inside of this part and is collected through this little tube here into that bag. This is another handy piece of equipment. It's called a reverse osmosis pump. And what this does is it removes the salt from the seawater. In here I've got salt water, and this tube Jerry's holding there, well, that's where the fresh water comes out of. And this is how it operates. And you can see though that you don't get very much water for quite a lot of pumping. So one tip is to do this pumping in the evening when you sweat less. Otherwise you may use up more water than you get back from it. But these pumps hadn't been invented 20 years ago. All Steve had with him were solar stills, which were proving unreliable at first.
The problem was that the waves would come by and take the solar still out to the end of its tether and snap it, which would fling the salt water into the fresh distillate, and I would end up with just salt water rather than fresh.